I talk about diabetes as such. I want to read two excerpts. One excerpt was written in the 1st century AD in the middle of what is now Turkey, called Cappadocia, by a man by the name of Eresius. And he was the first one in Greek to use the term diabetes. And this is what he said, and be careful with the adjectives, because the translation of the adjectives from Ionic Greek to English occurred in the middle of the 19th century by Charles Francis Adams, who was the son and grandson of our presidents, John Adams and John Francis Adams. Chapter 2, on diabetes. Diabetes is a wonderful affection, not very frequent among men, being a melting down of the flesh and limbs into urine. Its cause is of a cold and humid nature, as is dropsy. The course of the common is a common one, namely the kidneys and the bladder, where the patients never stop making water, but the flow is incessant, as if from the opening of aqueducts. The nature of the disease then is chronic, and it takes a long period to form. But the patient is short-lived if the condition of the disease be completely established, for the melting is rapid and the death is speedy. Now, he uses the term chronic because many times diseases took people away in the 1st century AD in days, but these people probably lived for weeks or months. Then a poem from the 20th century America by James Dickey, Georgian. And the title of the poem is Diabetes. One night I thirsted like a prince, then like a king, then like an empire, like a world on fire. I rose and flowed away and fell back once more to sleep. In an hour I was back in the kingdom, staggering my belly, going round with self-made night water, wondering what the hell. Months of having a tongue of flame convinced me I had better not go on this way. The doctor was young and nice. He said, I must tell you, my friend, that it is needles, moderation, and exercise. You don't want to look forward to gangrene and kidney failure, boils, blindness, infection, skin trouble, falling teeth, coma, and death. Okay? In sleep, my mouth went dry with my answer, and in it burned the sands of time with a new fury. He went through the symptoms of diabetes just like the patients that Eresius had 2,000 years earlier. Part of my conversation today will be autobiographical, and part of it will be what is the change in diabetes over the years. I first knew the word diabetes in 1938 when I was 12 years old. Nobody figured out the age now, please. But I was 12 years old in 1938, and we went on a road trip. I was living in Dallas. We were living in Dallas, Texas at the time. We went on a road trip to California. And on the way back, we had to stop frequently so my brother John could go to the bathroom. And finally, my mother said, go in there and see what is going on. So I went in, and Johnny was passing large amounts of urine, which were just absolutely clear, like water. So I reported that, and she wondered whether it was possible that he could be having diabetes. This is a case. Doctors always start with a case, even Mehmet Oz. New diabetes, new juvenile diabetes. And you notice they didn't talk about type 1 or ketosis prone or some of the other names that diabetes came under. It talked about juvenile diabetes. And the founder of your organization named it the juvenile diabetes because these were people who were young. This 8-year-old boy had 3 weeks of thirst. He had extra urine. He went to the doctor. The doctor said, you had diabetes. He was in a hospital for 10 days in Dallas. And he came home with 12 units of protamine zinc insulin. How many in this audience have used or know the word protamine zinc insulin? Yeah. And you're showing your age, but very few. And it was the first long-acting insulin because from 1922, when insulin was first available in Canada and then in the United States through Lilly, until 1937, there was no long-acting insulin. One had to take multiple shots of quick-acting insulin. And sometimes this was bad on kids because the kids didn't grow, and there was a condition called diabetic dwarfism or Moriarty syndrome, which cleared up very, very completely and doesn't exist anymore because the long-acting insulin protamine zinc was able to cover it through the night. He came home. He learned how to test the urine using the Benedict solution. And I was helping him because I was the chemist of the family. 2 years prior to this episode that we're talking about now, I received a chemistry set and I made all sorts of foul-smelling things and individual invisible ink and things like that. So I thought that I should learn how to do things. Next slide. But he didn't thrive in the first year. He didn't really grow as he should. And he was always hungry. I can remember my brother licking the plate with lettuce and things like that. So he went and saw a diabetes specialist in Chicago. And he was hospitalized again, placed on a better diet, more calories, still low carbohydrates, still high fat, but a diet that was more compatible with what he wanted to eat. And he felt more affected by that diet, and he grew normally. And he was changed over to a new insulin, which was not even on the market at that time, called neutral protamine hagedorn, or NPH insulin. How many have been on NPH insulin? A few more. And both of these, PZI and NPH, had protamine insulin, which slowed down the absorption of the insulin. And actually, everything being equal, he did much better and was able to be more active and was willing to let me do some ministrations to him. Next slide. So what did I learn to do for my brother since I was the chemist? Well, I tested the urine with Benedict solution, 10 drops, a teaspoon of Benedict's copper sulfate, 10 drops of urine, and put it over a heat. It was safer to put it in hot water and let it test, but it was slower. So I was able, with a few mistakes, to put it over the open flame so it wouldn't shoot out and dirty up my mother's kitchen. And, but so I was able to do that with pretty good, and my brother was only 8 years old, and pretty soon he learned how to do this himself. But I was able to do that. And I learned how to give insulin. You had to boil the syringes, boil the needles, sharpen the needles if necessary, and do that twice a day. We mixed NPH and regular. These were all U40. There was no U100 at the time, and actually there was no U80. U80 came in somewhat after the war, World War II, that is. I also carried food in case he had low blood sugar. And I tried to explain to our friends what diabetes was. Probably totally inadequate. But I said he has to take shots, and we have to measure his food, etc. These were needles that are similar to what was available in 1940. And if you look on the right, that's a 5 millimeter needle, 31 gauge, on a disposable syringe, which many of you probably use more than once a day. That's 2015. If you go over to the left, that's a mimic of what kids had to take in 1940. That's a 23 gauge needle. Now, most of the needles that the children used were 26 gauge or 27 gauge, but they were long like the ones in the center. The center ones are 12.7 millimeters or ½ an inch. And so it was tough for people to have to push this fairly long and fairly thick needle into the body more than once a day. Diabetes is one of these diseases that's with you 24/7. Other diseases, you take a few pills in the morning and it's okay. You take a pill in the morning and a pill in the evening, it's okay. But diabetes, 24/7. Next slide. So what was my personal, this is a little autobiography in diabetes practice. I wanted to be a physician, I think, before Johnny developed diabetes. I can't swear to it, there's no way I can do that, but I wanted to do it since I was a chemist, and we had a fine young doctor who lived across the street from us in Highland Park, Texas, and he would tell me about this and that when he came over to visit. So when I went to medical school, I decided that I would spend most of my time at Presbyterian Hospital in Chicago during the 3rd and 4th years, which were the clinical years. And under those circumstances, during the 3rd year, we went into homes and delivered to women who had had more than one baby. And I found the delivery of babies to be wonderful. To bring new life into the world was wonderful. And I noticed when I talked to my mentors that I said, I would like to be an obstetrician, but I don't want to do gynecology. And they said, forget it, White House, forget it. You can't do one without the other. When you're in your mid-40s, you'll get tired of delivering babies only. So with that one being out, and with one little side towards tropical medicine, and I knew I didn't want to live in the tropics, I went and spent time at Presbyterian in Chicago, and I would work up patients, talk to the intern about it, and then present the case to our rounder. And whenever a diabetic came in, after we presented the case, the rounder would say, oh my, another diabetic, call in Rollin Woodyard. So I said, maybe I should look at what Rollin Woodyard does, because I could do some of these things that they wanted to do, insulin and test the blood, test the urine and things like that. So I worked with Rollin Woodyard independently for a couple of weeks. And he was there with his white points, red points, and blue points. White points were carbohydrate, red points were fat, blue points were protein. And he was able, under these circumstances, to say if you have 3 white points, you take that much insulin. If you have 5 white points, you take that much insulin. Speaking about regular insulin before meals. And he introduced the patient, and these patients all were insulin dependent. Whether or not they were all juvenile, many of these were not juvenile, but they had been juvenile over time. He said, you've got to measure your food right. And he had us gram scales. It turned out that Rollin Woodyard was the number 2 physician in the country to take care of people with diabetes after Elliot Josman. At that time, there were no endocrinologists in general practice. The endocrinologists were mostly in the medical schools, and in the various cities, there would be internists who would concentrate on diabetes. And therefore, when somebody else, one of their colleagues, had a person with diabetes, most of whom required insulin, then they would send him to this diabetologist. Things have changed a little bit now, but nevertheless, the people who were interested in diabetes were the ones who saw the juvenile cases and some of those who were juvenile who grew up to be adults. And it was one interesting point was that many of them started having a camp. They maybe owned a farm or something like that, and they'd take these children out to have a week in the camp. Next slide. So here are some daily issues of diabetes. The gram scale was important, and everybody who left Presbyterian Hospital had a gram scale on the way out. Be accurate with the diet, and this is still a major issue even today in the management of diabetes, type 1 or type 2, especially type 2, is that there's too much food being eaten, not enough physical activity. At that time in 1940, there was only saccharin and no sugar-free pop. I remember my father making root beer, sugar-free root beer. It was not quite the same as the others, but he tried. I'd take my hat off to him. One thing I noticed after Johnny came home from the hospital is that everybody in the family, there were 4 of us, was on the diet. One person can't be on the diet, the other 3 eating different kinds of food. We all were on the diet, and there was no cakes or pies and things like that. Remember, there was no glucagon at that time, so you couldn't shoot a person with the glucagon as you can today to bring them out of a hypoglycemic coma. But you had to eat, and there was no 9/11 even in Texas. Probably wasn't any up here either. And so you had to do the best you could or rush them to the hospital. And there were not very many emergency rooms to take it. And I've shown you the shots. Next slide. Daily living in the world. Now there are people at schools who you can talk to tell them that so-and-so has diabetes. Not so then. There was a tendency for more education in the camps And the advantage of the camps was really that the kids could get together and they could see that somebody else was like them. They weren't alone in the world. And secondly, it was a vacation for them, safely, because there were MDs and RNs there. And there was also a vacation from the parents who for a week didn't have to think about the diabetes and the children. So that was the purpose of the diabetic camp, because they couldn't go to the regular camp. The other thing that was important, and is important right up to today, is that in a family where one is a diabetic, one child is a diabetic or a young person, the message from the parents has to be the same. You can't have a divided house. You can't have the father saying one thing and the mother saying something else. It has to be stable. In that way, the child will get the message properly. Next slide. Now, in 2015, I put down as the headlines, there's no cure yet, but how much has been made easier? Blood glucose testing, delivery of insulin. The diet is still very difficult. And if there are problems with control in type 1 or type 2, it usually relates to the diet. Hypoglycemia is still the bear in the closet. And the fear of hypoglycemia prevents high-quality control of the hyperglycemia. And that's one thing that we hope in the future will be handled, possibly by making an individual have insulin delivered directly to the liver rather than going into the bloodstream first and then coming back to the liver. That hasn't been tried except in an implantable pump. And the problem with the implantable pump was aligned into the peritoneal cavity, the cavity surrounding the intestines and like, was that foreign object into the peritoneal cavity, where 50% of the insulin was picked up and taken directly to the liver, was closed off really because it was a foreign body and you'd get scar tissue, but then you'd have to operate, take out the pump, put another line in if you wanted to continue like that. So implantable pumps at the present time are not feasible. But it does show that if you could figure out a way to get the insulin into the liver first and then later on, because it's been known that when you inject it, when insulin is secreted from the pancreas and goes into the portal vein into the liver, about 50% of it stays in the liver to control the liver's production of sugar. Unfortunately, when we give it under the skin, particularly if you give it after a meal and the food is already being absorbed, you're running behind and you cannot control the blood sugar after a meal. Hypoglycemia is a big problem also because we change from day to day. The advantage of a pump, the advantage of a CGM, continuous glucose monitor, makes a big difference for those people who are totally devoid of their own insulin. Probably in most type 2 patients it's not necessary, but there may be exceptions there. One of the issues, of course, there that occurs is this cost. It's very costly. And I asked one patient the other day how much he figures he pays out of pocket for his diabetes care, which includes a pump but does not include a CGM. And he thought about $2,000 per year out of pocket. I don't know what you all have, but there's probably a scale, but it's not cheap. Next slide. Personal opinion on issues in 2015. The major issue is that you've got to let science and maybe engineering take the time to be able to figure out other ways to make it easier for you. Diabetes happens to be a 24/7 issue, and it's not easy to do this. You have to give shots. Who likes shots? Nobody likes shots. You have to be careful with the diet. You have to realize that if you're very active or you miss a meal, you might have low blood sugar, the bear in the closet. So it's not easy. The other thing is that there's no point in saying damn diabetes or why me, because nobody has the answer to why me, although you can say damn diabetes quietly. The importance of exercise is good, and it should be the kind of exercise. This is true of type 1, more so of type 2s. We should get out there and do some exercise. I said in this slide that regular exercise of your choice is ideal, summer/winter. Exercise because you enjoy it rather than because you have to. Do something that you enjoy. I like bike riding, but not jogging. I tried jogging once and it just doesn't make sense to me. Walking is okay too. Identify your the risk that you have. Mine is falling off a bike and breaking a hip. I'm an old man and I should be very careful. So that advances are being made. The trouble is that people who go through this day after day become impatient with the advances, and that's understandable. But it just so happens that that's the way it is. Next slide. This is just a summary of what was 1940 versus 2015. And one of the major things is that human insulin is available now because the structure of insulin was discovered in England, for which the discoverer got the Nobel Prize. And there was a thought at the time that we're going to run out of pancreata from animals, from beef and pork. So now we won't run out of that, and insulin use is increasing. So there's a comparison of the two. Glucagon is available. Test the glucose in the blood. You don't have to wonder about the urine or whether it's first, second, or second specimen. Disposable syringes. Rapid-acting insulin, the analogs, like Vispro and Aspart and Glulisine. But some people then give it after the meal because they're scared of hypoglycemia, and therefore it doesn't work as well. The blood sugar is already on its way up. So your doctor can discuss that with you if you do it after the meal. And we have the hemoglobin A1C that can be measured, probably in the person with type 1 diabetes 4 times a year, but it's up to the individual patient and doctor on that. And the DCCT, which started in 1982, recruited the first patient in 1983, and closed down in 1993, showed without question that you can cut down the frequency of eye changes, kidney changes, changes in the nerves of the feet, etc., by using this. So it is in 2015 the right thing to try to control the diabetes well and to learn to live with it. And you have a little, is there another slide? Well, next slide. So what we're looking forward to? We look forward to better ways of managing diabetes, Better ways of managing diabetes, possibly a direct flow of insulin to the liver. It seems to me that if we can mimic nature, nature's pretty smart. If we can mimic nature, it might be better. But right now, I don't think there's an option for that. And then, of course, the high quality control over time. And then the overweight and obesity for type 2 diabetes, or type 1 who gets too fat, because all it does is make the body more resistant to insulin. Next slide. Changes from 1940 to 2015. Gadgetry, pumps, human insulin, regular checks on the eyes, kidneys, A1C. Antibiotics has been a big thing. In 1938, when my brother got diabetes, the only anti-infective agent was the sulfonamides. There weren't any antibiotics. Now we have antibiotics up to kazoo. No white canes, no seeing eye dogs in the office. I should say rare white canes. In the diabetes camp, and diabetes is out of the closet. It must be very difficult to have diabetes and be in the closet. One patient was very successful at that. Next slide. No signal? Okay, I'll read this. This is from President Obama's address to the Congress. Oops. Can you put that back on? I appreciate the picture of me there, but I'd rather read it. Okay, this was in January of 2015. Tonight I'm launching a new precision medicine initiative to bring us closer to curing diseases like cancer and diabetes, and to give all of us access to the personalized information we need to keep ourselves and our families healthiest. And what this means is that looking at the genetics of the person, and maybe how many people out here have diabetes? Okay. None of you who raise your hands are identical to the next person unless you're an identical twin. And so that maybe in your case you need something less or something more intense, not so intense, etc., etc. And so the next thing that's going to happen in medicine is to look at the genetics of individual people and why they react to diseases the way they do. And I'll be on a cloud by then, and I'll look down and I'll say, oh, that's what the answer is. Now I know. And this will be very exciting for the people who have diabetes 24/7. Thank you for your attention.